Clarence Thomas demands Jasmine Crockett's resignation. She reads his own texts and he quits. March 12, 2025, Washington, D.C. The morning began like any other inside the marbled corridors of power, but by 10:30 a.m. a political earthquake was underway. Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, one of the most powerful men in the American judiciary, did something unprecedented. Through the court's press office, he released a scathing statement calling for the immediate resignation of Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. He accused her of being unfit for office, of undermining the Constitution, of being a threat to the very foundations of democracy. The media exploded. Cable news anchors dropped everything to dissect the bombshell. Legal analysts were stunned. Even Thomas's allies seemed caught off guard. Most justices stayed silent, not Clarence Thomas. For the first time in his 33-year career on the bench, he had gone public with a personal attack, aimed squarely at a rising star in Congress. But what Thomas didn't know was that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life, because Jasmine Crockett had been quietly preparing for this moment. She had been investigating him, and now she was ready to fight back. March 13, 2025, the day before the storm. Inside the Rayburn House office building, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett sat behind a closed office door. No press, no advisors, just her a thick manila folder and a tablet glowing with digital evidence. For months she had been quietly gathering data, text messages, financial records, and travel logs. She hadn't said a word to the media. She didn't need to. She let the evidence speak. Every line of every document told a story. A luxury RV bought in Harlan Crow's name, a flight to Bali paid by a donor, a loan disguised as a gift, emails that matched rulings with financial perks. Some of the evidence came through congressional subpoenas, others through anonymous tips. But it all pointed in the same direction. Clarence Thomas had crossed ethical lines repeatedly, and now he had attacked her. Crockett wasn't angry. She was focused. Her response wouldn't be loud, it would be surgical. That night she tweeted just one sentence. "Tomorrow Justice Thomas will learn what silence has been preparing." The post went viral in seconds. Speculation ignited. Was she bluffing? Would she really challenge one of the most powerful legal figures in the country? At 2 a.m., the lights were still on in her office. She wasn't rehearsing, she was reviewing. Cross-checking timelines, verifying message logs. This wasn't a press stunt. It was an indictment built with congressional teeth. Outside reporters gathered. Cable networks shifted their programming. Talk radio flared with both support and scorn. Allies warned her to tread carefully. Enemies prepared to dismiss her as reckless. But Crockett didn't blink. She remembered every vote Thomas cast against civil rights. She remembered the silence when his scandals were dismissed. She remembered Thurgood Marshall, and she remembered the people who had trusted her to speak. At 9:45 a.m., she held a staff meeting. "No leaks, no spin, just truth," she said. Her chief of staff nodded. "It's all ready. If he wants a fight, we'll bring the Constitution with us." Crockett smiled. "No," she said. "We'll bring his own words." By noon, the Capitol was buzzing. Rumors swirled. Did she have texts, audio names? Most assumed she'd make a speech, a passionate rebuttal, maybe even a symbolic gesture. They were wrong. At 2 p.m., Sharp Crockett stepped into the press conference room. She wore the same Navy suit she had worn when she defeated Chief Justice Roberts in committee. The room fell silent. She walked to the podium, held up a folder, and began, "Justice Thomas has demanded my resignation. He's questioned my fitness for office. Today I respond not with opinions, but with facts." She opened the folder and started reading. January 15, 2023. Text message from Clarence Thomas to his wife, Ginny Thomas. "Crow says the RV purchase can be structured as a loan. We never have to pay back. He also offered the private jet for our anniversary trip to Bali. These people really know how to take care of their friends." Gasps. Flashes. Questions shouted. Crockett held up her hand. There's more. She read another December 3, 2024. After oral arguments on a voting rights case, the liberals think they're so smart, but I'm going to make sure their precious voting rights get gutted. Harlan will be so pleased. Now the room was in chaos, but Crockett wasn't finished. This is just a preview. The full documentation will be submitted to the House Judiciary Committee. Tomorrow morning, I will begin the process of accountability. She paused. Justice Thomas called for my resignation. I call for his. And then she walked out. No applause, no chant, just silence. The kind that follows an earthquake. March 14, 2025. The aftershock. News of the press conference erupted like a second detonation. Within minutes of Crockett's walk-off, every major network cut to rolling coverage. Her words, her evidence, her tone, each replayed on a loop. Analysts scrambled to dissect implications, tone, and legal impact. Clarence Thomas's camp issued a short press statement. Justice Thomas is reviewing the allegations and will respond in due course. No denial, no defense, just stall tactics. Inside the Supreme Court, the atmosphere turned toxic. Clerks whispered. Justices avoided eye contact. Chief Justice Roberts convened an emergency meeting. Some conservative justices urged Thomas to step down or at least issue a strong public rebuttal, but Thomas stayed silent. Again, he had underestimated Crockett. Overnight momentum shifted. The Washington Post ran a front-page exposé. The New York Times called for his resignation. Even conservative-leaning outlets like the Wall Street Journal urged a formal investigation. Fox News, once his strongest ally, broke ranks. Tucker Carlson, clearly blindsided, opened his segment with "We need answers, and we need them now." By noon the next day, Crockett's office was flooded with support. More than 120 House Democrats signed on to a resolution of impeachment. Protesters gathered outside the court demanding accountability. Activists held up signs, "No justice above justice." Then came the DOJ. Attorney General Merrick Garland announced that the Department of Justice had opened a criminal investigation into Clarence Thomas. The charges: federal bribery, tax evasion, ethics violations. The announcement struck Washington like thunder. Crockett didn't gloat. She worked. She directed her staff to prepare documentation for committee hearings. Every receipt, every flight manifest, every financial irregularity cross-referenced, verified, ready to stand legal scrutiny. Thomas, feeling cornered, took a gamble. He went on a conservative podcast. "I've done nothing wrong," he said. "Those text messages are personal. Taken out of context. This is a witch hunt." But then came the slip. When asked directly about the January 15th message, the RV, the private jet, Thomas responded, "That was a private conversation between my wife and me. Even if I said those things, it doesn't prove illegality. It was an implicit admission." Within hours, Republican support began to crack. Senator Susan Collins issued a cautious statement. Senator Mitt Romney outright called for Thomas to resign. By March 16th, the Supreme Court was in full crisis. Chief Justice Roberts again met privately with Thomas. Sources confirmed Roberts gave him an ultimatum: step down or face public censure by your peers. That same night, Jasmine Crockett went on MSNBC. "I didn't come to Congress to pick fights," she said, "but I came to protect the Constitution. No one, no judge, no justice is above the law." Social media surged. "Thomas must resign" trended worldwide. That morning, 60 Minutes aired a special segment, "The Case Against Clarence Thomas." Wall Street reacted too. Shares of corporations tied to Thomas's donor network dropped sharply. Financial ethics watchdogs launched their own inquiries. And then it happened. March 17, 2025, 6:00 p.m., a short press release. "After 33 years of service, I am retiring from the Supreme Court effective immediately. No apology, no reflection, just exit." It was over. But for Jasmine Crockett and for the country, the reckoning had just begun. March 18, 2025. The days that reshaped the court. The resignation had landed like an asteroid. What followed was the dust cloud, the reckoning. Overnight headlines across America declared victory for accountability. The New York Times, justice falls. The Washington Post, Crockett's case cracks the court. Even the Wall Street Journal simply read, Thomas out. But the system wasn't satisfied with a resignation. Within 24 hours, the House Judiciary Committee announced formal impeachment hearings would proceed, regardless focused not just on Clarence Thomas, but also the donors, fixers, and allies who enabled him. Jasmine Crockett was named lead prosecutor in the inquiry. This was no longer a personal vendetta. It was institutional cleansing. By March 19th, financial records were pouring in, from subpoenaed banks, telecom providers, and shell companies. What they found stunned even seasoned investigators. Millions of dollars in undisclosed gifts. A shadow network of corporate jets, luxury vacations, and backdoor payments. Evidence of votes cast to benefit donors disguised under judicial language. Private communications that revealed coordination with politicians pushing cases before the court. The DOJ expanded its case. Charges included federal bribery, obstruction of justice, conspiracy, wire fraud, and tax evasion. Thomas's legal team tried to suppress evidence. Motions were denied. Ginny Thomas, once defiant, now faced legal jeopardy of her own. Congressional emails revealed she helped structure shell transactions and pressure court staff into secrecy. She was formally subpoenaed. The mood in Washington grew somber. This wasn't just about one man anymore. It was about the legitimacy of an entire branch of government. On March 20th, President Biden addressed the nation. This moment demands reflection and reform. No public servant is immune to accountability, not even those on the highest bench. He announced his intent to nominate a replacement within 30 days. The shortlist included respected progressive judges and legal scholars. The frontrunner, Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson, who had already served as a federal appellate judge and had the backing of both civil rights groups and constitutional law experts. Meanwhile, across the country, protests turned celebratory. Young voters, legal advocates, and ethics watchdogs held candlelight vigils that doubled as rallies. Cities projected Crockett's now iconic quote onto buildings, "His own words will be his undoing." At universities, students demanded ethics courses be added to law school curricula. Yale and Harvard launched internal reviews of their historic support for Thomas. In Congress, a bipartisan ethics reform bill began to gain momentum. Dubbed the Supreme Court Ethics Act, it proposed mandatory financial disclosures, gift limits, an independent oversight body, and term limits for justices. Crockett threw her full support behind the bill. Resignation is not the end, she told a packed chamber. It's the beginning of a just court. On March 22nd, Thomas was indicted by a federal grand jury. The charges were sweeping and detailed. That evening, Crockett gave a live address. No teleprompter. Just conviction. We've witnessed a justice fall, but more importantly, we've proven that truth still matters, that evidence still wins, and that democracy still breathes. This isn't about one man. It's about a future where power answers to principle. She paused. This is our reckoning, and it's not over yet. April-June 2025. A new era begins. With Thomas gone and indicted, the legal and political landscape began to shift fast. On April 1st, 2025, President Biden officially nominated Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson to the Supreme Court. The announcement made in the Rose Garden drew thunderous applause from civil rights groups and constitutional scholars alike. This is not just a nomination, Biden said. It's a restoration. The confirmation process began immediately. Hearings were tense but swift. Republicans, still reeling from the Thomas scandal, struggled to mount credible opposition. The public, meanwhile, was overwhelmingly in favor. Polls showed a 68% approval rating for Jackson's nomination. By April 22nd, the Senate confirmed her by a 54-46 vote. For the first time in more than half a century, the Supreme Court held a liberal majority. The shift was seismic. Within weeks, the court revisited and reversed key decisions on voting rights, reproductive health, and environmental protection. In a landmark 5-4 ruling, the court restored key provisions of the Voting Rights Act that had been gutted under Thomas's tenure. In another case, the court ruled that states could no longer restrict access to abortion services before viability. The ruling was heralded as a turning point for reproductive justice. But the biggest surprise came in late May, when the court ruled in favor of strict climate accountability. Corporations were now required to disclose environmental impact in real time. Activists celebrated. Industry groups fumed. Meanwhile, in Congress, Crockett's Supreme Court Ethics Act passed both chambers. The new law mandated yearly financial disclosures for all justices, required recusal in conflict of interest cases, and established an independent oversight board with investigative authority. This isn't reform, Crockett told reporters. It's restoration. The cultural shift was just as dramatic. Law schools revised their curricula. Legal textbooks added chapters on the Thomas case, detailing how Crockett's evidence reshaped modern oversight doctrine. A new field emerged: judicial accountability law. Media followed suit. Documentaries were greenlit. Streaming platforms scrambled for exclusive interviews. Crockett refused most requests, saying, "This isn't entertainment, it's justice." In May, Time magazine named Jasmine Crockett Person of the Year. The cover image showed her standing on the Capitol steps, folder in hand, with the tagline, "Truth has teeth." Across America, a younger generation of lawmakers and activists rose up inspired by her methods. They demanded oversight of federal judges, transparency from politicians, and corporate accountability. A new era of reform had taken root. Even international observers took notice. The European Union praised the U.S. for holding a sitting Supreme Court justice accountable. Anti-corruption leaders in Brazil, South Korea, and South Africa cited the case as proof that democracy could police itself. Back home, Thomas's criminal trial loomed. Scheduled for September, it was expected to be one of the most closely watched legal spectacles in American history. Charges included bribery, tax fraud, and obstruction. Ginny Thomas agreed to testify as part of a plea deal. Clarence Thomas, once the most powerful conservative voice on the court, now faced life as a defendant. Crockett remained steady. When asked whether she'd attend the trial, she replied, "I've already done my part. The rest is up to the law." But in the minds of millions, she had already redefined it. September-December 2025. Judgment and aftermath. Clarence Thomas's criminal trial opened on September 3, 2025 in the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia. The courtroom was packed with press, legal scholars, and curious citizens. The air buzzed with tension. This was the first time a former Supreme Court justice faced federal prosecution. Federal prosecutors, armed with reams of text messages, bank records, and witness testimony, laid out a devastating case. They showed how Thomas used his position to enrich himself and his allies. They revealed a complex scheme of unreported gifts, luxury vacations, and donor-driven influence peddling. The star witness was Ginny Thomas. Under oath, she testified about how the couple coordinated with billionaire donors, accepted covert payments, and concealed transactions from ethics authorities. Her voice, sometimes trembling, offered a glimpse into the culture of entitlement and secrecy that had defined their decades at the court's apex. Crockett didn't testify. She wasn't needed. Her evidence was the backbone of the prosecution. After a 4-week trial, the jury deliberated just 3 days. On October 4th, Clarence Thomas was found guilty on all counts: bribery, conspiracy, tax fraud, and obstruction of justice. Sentencing followed in November. The judge, in a scathing rebuke, declared, "You used the highest court in the land as a personal cash register. You betrayed the Constitution and the people it protects." Thomas received 7 years in federal prison. His Supreme Court pension was stripped. his law licenses revoked. History recorded his fall with unblinking clarity, but justice didn't stop at the courtroom. The ripple effects continued. By year's end, 3 other federal judges were under investigation. 2 resigned, 1 was indicted. The judiciary implemented mandatory ethics training for all lifetime appointed judges. Crockett's office released a 200-page oversight guide, titled The Thomas Standard, now used by congressional committees nationwide. Media continued to dissect the case not with sensationalism, but as a study in systemic vulnerability. Documentaries won Emmys. The Library of Congress archived Crockett's folder under historic oversight milestones. In December, a coalition of civil society groups presented Crockett with the Lincoln Integrity Award. In her acceptance speech, she said, "I didn't bring down Clarence Thomas. His own words did. I just made sure the truth reached the light," and yet she refused to rest on that victory. She led the passage of the Judicial Transparency Act, requiring lifetime access to justices' digital communications for oversight bodies and criminal penalties for non-disclosure. Young lawyers began citing her work in their theses. Civics teachers taught her case in classrooms. Activists wore shirts emblazoned with her mantra, "Accountability isn't radical, it's required." By the close of 2025, public trust in the judiciary was on the rise again. Polls showed a 62% approval rating for the reformed Supreme Court. Ethics watchdogs credited the turnaround to a cultural shift rooted in one historic investigation. Thomas began serving his sentence at FCI Cumberland, a federal correctional institution in Maryland. He granted no interviews. His name, once invoked to represent conservative jurisprudence, now stood as a warning. And Jasmine Crockett, she was already drafting the next ethics bill. In a quiet moment on New Year's Eve, a reporter asked her if she felt justice had finally been served. She smiled. "Justice isn't a destination, it's a habit." And with that, the story of Clarence Thomas, the rise, the scandal, the fall, closed its final chapter. But Crockett's story was just beginning. January-June 2026. Beyond one justice. The new year dawned with a question: what comes after justice? For Jasmine Crockett, the answer was simple: more justice. By January 15th, her office introduced the Judicial Independence and Accountability Act, a sweeping follow-up to the transparency legislation she had already spearheaded. This bill proposed a rotating 18-year term for Supreme Court justices, regular ethics audits, and public access to non-deliberative court records. Critics howled, supporters mobilized. The bill ignited fierce national debate. Cable news shows aired nightly panels. Editorials flooded the presses. Conservative think tanks painted it as judicial harassment, while reform advocates called it a necessary reset. But the grassroots responded with energy. Activist coalitions, law students, and voting rights groups launched a nationwide campaign, Reform the Robes. Town halls were packed. Local forums turned into rallies. Young Americans, once disillusioned by opaque institutions, now demanded reform. Crockett wasn't just leading legislation, she was leading a movement. Meanwhile, the Supreme Court, reshaped by Thomas's absence and Justice Jackson's influence, handed down a series of rulings that reflected the new ideological balance. Corporate regulation was strengthened. Immigration policy was softened. Religious freedom cases were now balanced against civil rights with newfound nuance. Legal scholars called it the Jackson Doctrine, a return to rights-focused constitutional interpretation. Crockett, though, kept her focus on systemic change. She convened a bipartisan ethics summit in February, bringing together judges, former clerks, legal educators, and ethics watchdogs. The result, the formation of the National Commission on Judicial Standards, tasked with developing a unified code of conduct across all federal courts. By spring, the Commission's draft standards included restrictions on judicial stock ownership, mandatory annual recusal disclosures, and an independent ethics review board with subpoena power. The cultural impact was just as significant. Jasmine Crockett became a symbol of ethical vigilance. Her image adorned murals in D.C., Atlanta, and Oakland. Her congressional speeches were remixed into viral TikToks. College campuses started Crockett chapters groups focused on political transparency. She gave guest lectures at Yale and Howard. Her alma mater renamed its moot court competition after her. But Crockett remained grounded. In April, she returned to her hometown in Texas for a town hall. Speaking in a modest community center, she told constituents, "This didn't start in Washington. It started with the belief that one voice can demand accountability, yours." As spring turned to summer, momentum surged. The Judicial Independence and Accountability Act passed the House with a narrow bipartisan majority, the Senate facing pressure from an energized electorate scheduled hearings. Crockett testified again, not as an accuser, but as an architect of the future. "Our courts shape our freedom," she said. "If they can't be questioned, they can't be trusted. Reform isn't about revenge, it's about renewal." As applause echoed through the chamber, even her critics had to concede Crockett wasn't stopping. She had turned one investigation into an enduring movement, one resignation into a restoration. And as June closed and Congress prepared to recess, Jasmine Crockett stood on the Capitol steps once more. "Justice is a habit," she repeated, and across the nation, people had begun to practice it. July-October 2026. Justice beyond the court. As summer deepened, the movement Crockett had sparked became institutionalized. Reform was no longer just a political talking point. It was now law, curriculum, and culture. On July 4, 2026, President Biden signed the Judicial Independence and Accountability Act into law. Fireworks in D.C. carried extra meaning. Across the nation, crowds erupted in celebration. The signing was televised live, with Crockett standing just behind the president. She didn't smile for the cameras. She looked resolute. The work wasn't done. Immediately, federal agencies began implementing the act's sweeping mandates. Term limits were officially logged into court appointment schedules. The first ethics board was seated by July 20th. Their first assignment review, all pending recusals for potential conflicts. By mid-August, the Supreme Court released a transparency portal listing every justice's financial holdings, recusals, travel expenses, and meeting logs. It was the first time in American history such data was made publicly available. Media hailed the transformation. The New York Times called it a sunlight revolution. But Crockett knew real accountability required more than databases. In September, she partnered with tech experts and civil rights groups to launch the Justice Monitor, a real-time dashboard tracking judicial activity, ethics compliance, and case impact summaries. Within a month, it had 1 million active users. High school civics classes began teaching the Crockett Doctrine, an approach to oversight grounded in transparency, accessibility, and systemic renewal. At the same time, her political capital soared. Progressives urged her to consider a Senate run. Moderates admired her discipline. Even skeptical conservatives admitted her approach was surgical, not sensational. Crockett stayed focused. When asked about her future, she replied, "The institution still breathes. We're not finished cleaning the air." Back in the courtroom, reforms began to reshape behavior. Justices recused themselves more frequently. Clerks filed whistleblower protections. Appellate judges cited the new ethics code in dissents and concurrences. In October, the court issued a decision in a landmark case involving data privacy and AI surveillance. In a 5-4 ruling, it sided with individual rights. Jackson wrote the majority opinion. Her final footnote credited the evolving constitutional conscience of the people. Crockett didn't comment publicly, but aides confirmed she cried when she read it. That same month, Clarence Thomas's appeals were denied. His name faded from headlines, and Jasmine Crockett's became synonymous with a higher standard, not just of law, but of leadership. From Capitol Hill to classrooms, her work inspired a new mantra for a new era. Accountability isn't a moment, it's a mindset.